Hi guys, welcome to Tactic Devs. In today's video, I will be implementing a sidebar navigation control in WPF. Before we can get to the coding, let's first take a look at the UI composition of what I'm going to be implementing. Now this implementation will consist of two major components, the sidebar and the frame. The sidebar will be used to host the buttons and the frame will be used to host the pages. Now starting with the sidebar, I will be using a list box control to host the sidebar buttons. The reason for that is because the list box control inherits from the selector class. This means it will allow me to keep track of the selected items. For the sidebar buttons, I will create a custom control. The custom control will contain an icon and a URI property. The URI property will hold information about the page that we intend to navigate to. This page information will be then used to navigate to the specified page when the button is clicked. So let's go to Visual Studio and get to the coding. Alright, so here in Visual Studio, I already have a WPF project set up. So the first step is I'll create a custom control, which is the sidebar button. So I'll go ahead and add this control to the project. So I'll say add new item. Then under the WPF tab, I'll select custom control. I'll name this control nav button. Okay, so Visual Studio added in a class called nav button. And apparently it inherits from the control class. Now in this case, I'll be inheriting from the list box item class. And I'll be extending this class. So say list box item. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add in two extra properties. So I'll say dependency property. Okay, so the first property will be of the type URI. So I'm going to give it a name, nav link. So this will hold information about a resource, which will be a page. Then I'll set the owner class to nav button and the default value to no. So basically this property will be used to hold information about how we can find a specific page within our application. Now the second one will be of the type geometry. So this will hold information about the geometry of the icon that we intend to use for this custom control. So I'll just give it a name icon here and I'll set its owner class to nav button, which is this very class we are creating. Then set the default to no. Okay, so apparently that's it for this custom control and this information is enough. Now here, if you can see in the Solution Explorer, there's a folder that was added in when I created this control. It's called the themes folder. It has a file called generic and this is a resource dictionary. Let's just go ahead and open it up. Okay, so in this resource dictionary is a style and this style is targeting the nav button class, which is the class we created. And here it's setting a property, which is the template property, and it's setting it to a control template. So apparently the control template is what defines the visual appearance of the control. So here we only have a border. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and add in extra stuff to this control template. So here I'm going to set this border to transparent. So the reason for that is sometimes the border might be set to no, and that means the control might not receive certain types of hit tests. For example, when the mouse hovers over the control, because it's set to no, the system won't detect. So here we set it to transparent. Now what I'm going to do is I'm also going to set the corner radius of this border. I'll set it to 8 pixels and I'll set the padding to a template binding. So basically what the template binding does, it allows us to access information that's defined in this class here, in the nav button class. So I'm going to bind this padding to the padding property that's defined in this class. Okay, now here I'm going to add in an element to the border, and this is a path element. So this will be used to visualize the icon. So we have a path there. What I'm going to do is I'll set its data property to a template binding. Now this property defines the geometry of the path. So I'll bind it to the icon property that I created earlier on in the class. So I'll set the stretch to uniform, and the color of this path, which is the fill, I'm going to set it to a dark shade of gray. Okay, so I'll go and say 7B. Okay, so that's a dark shade of gray. I'll set the height and width of this path to 18 pixels. Alright, so I'll go ahead and name the border and the path. I'll give them names. So I'll say for the border, I'll just give the name back, meaning background. So the reason I'm naming them is so that I can access them within the control template here. Okay, so apparently I have the basics of this control, which is a border and a path at the center. So this already defines the appearance of the control. But what I want to do is I want to define some behavior. So when the mouse hovers over the control, or when I select a specific button, I want to change the appearance of this to highlight the selected button. So I'm going to set some triggers for this control template. So basically a trigger is like kind of like an event, but not really an event. It's looking for a specific condition to occur, then we can use that to now set specific properties on this control. So in this case, this trigger will basically observe a specific property. So in this case, it will observe a property which is the is mouse over. So basically this is when the mouse hovers over the control. So when the condition is set to true, when it's true, then we can set specific properties here. So I'll use a setter to do that. So I'll be setting the background property of this border here. Now I need to specify in the setter which property and which element I'm targeting. So I'll say target name. So I'll set the target name to back. Then the value will be set to a light shade of blue. So I'll say okay, so that should do it. So I'll just copy this setter and paste. Now in this case, I'll be changing the fill of this path, which is our icon here. So I'll set the property to fill, and then I'll change the target name to icon. So here we'll be targeting the icon there. So whenever I hover over the control, I would want it to be set to a dark shade of blue. So say all right. Now what I'm going to do here is I'm we add in another trigger. So I'll just copy and paste. Now in this case, the trigger is going to observe a specific condition. Now this one will be the is selected. So what happens is when the mouse hovers, it will show us these colors, and then when we select, it will set them to this color. So as long as select is set to true, then the colors will remain as they are defined here. So that should define the appearance and the behavior of the control. The next thing is I want to also set certain properties of this control, which is our nav button. So here at the style level, I'm going to add in another setter, not within the control template, but at the style level. So this is basically setting the default values of specific properties. So I'll say setter. So I'm going to set the horizontal alignment of this control. So I always want it to be at the center of the parent. In this case, the parent is a list box. So whenever we place it inside a list box, it should center itself. All right. I'll copy and paste. Then I also set the cursor on this control. I'll set it to be a hand. So whenever I hover over the control, it will set to a hand. Okay, so apparently that's it for the custom control. Now I'll be going to the main window.xaml file. Okay, here. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to divide this grid into two columns. So here I'm going to add in a column. Okay, so the first column, I'm going to define the column's width to 50 pixels. Then on the second column, I'll just leave it undefined. So this will set the second column to a width, which is an auto width, to just take the available space. Okay, now inside the grid, I'm going to add in a list box. And I'll give it a name. I'm going to name it sidebar. I'll set its border thickness to 0 so that it doesn't have a border around it. Then I'll set its top margin to 50 pixels. Okay, so I'll leave some room at the top here. All right, now I'm going to add in a frame as well. Oh, what I'm going to do for this list box, I'll place it inside the first column. Now, apparently it's in the first column, but I want to be explicit about that. So I'll say grid column. So I'll set the column property to 0, which is the first column. It's an indexed number, so it starts from 0. Then I'm going to add in a frame element, which will host our pages. I'll set it in the second column, so I'll set the grid column property to 1. Then I'll give it a name. I'll name it nav frame, and I'll give it a background of light gray, shade of light gray. Okay, just to give it some distinction. Now here I have a list box with some space at the top there. So what I'm going to do at that space at the top, I'm going to add in a path. So it'll just be kind of like a logo, just to make it interesting. So I'll add in a path. Stretch will be set to uniform. The fill will be set to a dark shade of blue. the height and width 25 pixels. Now you may not need this. I'm just doing it so that it looks interesting. Okay, so what I'm going to do for this data property here, I'm going to just paste in some geometry syntax so that we can have the path, the geometry, the icon up here. Now what I'm going to do is I'll place it here at the top since we left some space there. Okay, so I'll do that by just setting the margin, the top margin, to maybe 2 pixels. And I'll set the alignment to top. So vertical alignment. Okay, so we have our icon there. Let me add some more margin. I'll say 5 pixels. 10 will do. Okay, so for the geometry, I'm just going to paste in the information here. All right, so here we have the icon. It's just a Windows logo. Okay, so that should do it. All right. Now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add in the custom control to the list box. Now before I can do that, I'm going to first build the solution. All right, so the solution was built successfully. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add in the nav button control. So I'll say nav, and you can see it appears here. Okay, so here what I'm going to do is I'm going to give it a margin of 3 pixels and a padding of 6 pixels. Okay, then I'm going to define the geometry through the icon property. Remember, we created this property in the class. Okay, so I'll go ahead and just paste in the geometry syntax here. Okay, so there we have it. So you can see here is our custom control and we have an icon there. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to paste in the rest of the buttons and the icons here. All right, so I went ahead and added in the other buttons. Now here you can see we have the icons here for all the buttons. Now what I'm going to do now is I'm going to test the application to see if these buttons are selectable and the behavior that we defined in the control template is exactly the way we want it to be. Okay, so I'll go ahead and do that. All right, so the application is up and running, and if I try to hover, we can see the behavior and the cursor also changes. So let me see if I can select. Okay, it's selected and the rest works just fine. Okay, so I'll go ahead and close this. Okay, so now the next step is to implement the navigation. So what I'm going to do is that for each individual button here, I'm going to link it to a specific page. Now apparently in my project I do not have any pages defined, so I'll just go ahead and create a folder and add in some pages. Now for each page it will just be a blank page with some text at the center. Okay, so I'll just go ahead and do that. All right, so now I have the pages defined here. So if I click on one, you can see it's just a blank page with some text. Okay, now here in the class, which is the nav button class, we defined a property called navlink, which stores data of the type URI. So basically that's just information about the resource of the page. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to define the URI for each individual button here. So basically pointing to which page. Okay, so I'll say navlink. Now in this case, because I stored it inside a folder called pages, so I'll say pages / page 1.xaml. Remember to include the file extension. All right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to paste for the rest for the sake of speed. Okay, now I have all the navlink properties defined here. So what I'll do is I'll now implement the navigation. Now for this frame, I'm going to set the navigation UI visibility to hidden so that it doesn't show a toolbar when we navigate between pages. Now what I'm going to do to implement the logic is I'm going to set an event handler, which is basically a method that will handle a specific event. So in this case, it's the selection changed event here. So I'm going to set that to a new event handler. Okay, so what will happen here is this: whenever we change the selection, so when we select a single button here or a different button, this event will be raised and it will be handled by this method here. Now I would also like to set the selection mode to single, because you only want to navigate to a single page and only select one button at a time. Okay, so let's go to the code behind. All right, now here we can see we do have the event handler. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a variable, and I'll just name it selected. And this variable is going to return the sidebar. Then we'll set it to the selected item, not items, the single item here. Now we know that this item is a nav button item, so we need to cast that to a nav button. So say as nav button. Okay, so we now have the selected navigation button. So what can we do with this button? We are going to do this. So for the frame, I gave it a name, nav frame. I'll call a specific method which is called the navigate method here. So this method has got 4 overrides and it takes in a URI. Now remember, we stored the link to the page inside a property called navlink. Okay, and it's in the form of a URI. So here we have our selected button. So we say selected button, then get the navlink from this button. Then just navigate us to that navlink. So the frame is now going to display the page that's defined in the navlink. Now you can see this warning here. The reason for that is this can be possibly a no value. So it might, just warn you. But in our case, we know that we do have a button selected. All right. So that should do it. So I'll go ahead and test the code. All right, so the app is up and running. So apparently we do not have anything selected. So if I select, we have page 1, page 2, page 3, and page 4. You can go back to page 1 and the like. So the code to this tutorial will be down in the video description. Now remember to subscribe and like. See you in the next one.